My sister, Emma, and I were only 8 and 6 when we were placed in the children's home. After the tragic death of our parents, our grandparents, bless them, tried to take us in, but with their frail health and meager finances, they just couldn't. They made one thing very clear to the social workers though: we were to be adopted together or not at all. That was our bond, our unspoken vow as siblings. We clung to each other like lifelines, trying to make sense of our new reality, this dark world without our parents, where everything smelled of stale food and sadness. We'd never imagined life without our mom and dad, but now we found ourselves standing in the grim lobby of what was, without a doubt, the worst children's home imaginable. From the moment we walked through those rusted metal doors, it was clear that the place was wrong. It wasn't just the peeling paint or the dim, flickering lights. It was the atmosphere. There was an overwhelming sense of dread. The children in the home didn't play, they didn't smile. They were ghosts, moving from one depressing task to another, eyes hollow and devoid of hope. The administration ran the place with iron fists. Mrs. Crenshaw, the head of the orphanage, had the personality of a rock that had been left out in the rain for far too long, cold, wet, and hard. And as for the caretakers, they weren't much better. Some of them took pleasure in the misery of others, like the wicked Miss Agatha, who seemed to enjoy making children cry. Miss Agatha, with her tight bun and permanently scowling face, could reduce any child to tears with a single glare. And she did, frequently. In this house of lost children, Emma and I tried to stay hopeful. Our grandparents had promised that we would be adopted together, that someone kind would come and give us a new home. Every night, as we huddled together on our tiny bed, I whispered promises to Emma. I told her that no matter what, we would stay together. That I would protect her. That everything would be okay. I had no idea how wrong I was. When I was 16 and Emma had just turned 14, the unthinkable happened. A well-to-do couple arrived at the children's home one rainy afternoon. They looked perfect, the kind of people you'd see on the cover of a family magazine. Mrs. Sinclair was all pearls and soft-spoken words, while Mr. Sinclair was tall, with a gentle, authoritative presence. They had 2 boys, they said, but they wanted to adopt a girl. A sweet, well-behaved girl. Naturally, the administration paraded Emma in front of them like a prize pony. Emma had always been the gentler of the 2 of us, quiet, kind, and polite. Mrs. Crenshaw told the Sinclairs that Emma would make the perfect daughter. But there was one problem. They didn't want me. I wasn't surprised. I was too old, too much trouble. No one wanted a 16-year-old boy from a children's home, especially not one as damaged as me. But there was a rule. Our grandparents had been very clear. We were not to be separated. Emma was not to be adopted without me. Mrs. Crenshaw didn't care about our grandparents' wishes. She didn't care about the promise we had made to each other. She cared about one thing, getting rid of children, and so she did what she wanted. She handed Emma over to the Sinclairs, without my consent, without Emma's consent, without even blinking. I'll never forget the moment they took her away. Emma's face, pressed up against the car window as they drove off, her eyes wide with fear, her hand pressed against the glass. She was silently screaming for me, her brother, the only family she had left in the world. And I couldn't do anything. I stood in the rain, soaking wet, watching my sister disappear. The hollow feeling that settled in my chest never really left. After Emma was taken, I was lost. Every day at the children's home felt like a slow-motion nightmare. The cruelty of the administration and the bullying from other children seemed to intensify now that I didn't have Emma by my side. Miss Agatha took special pleasure in reminding me that no one would ever want me. "You think someone's going to adopt a 16-year-old boy?" she'd sneer. "Ha! You'll be out on the streets in 2 years, and no one will remember your name." Her words hurt more than the occasional slap she'd give out. She was right, of course. At 16, I was too old for adoption, and in 2 short years, I'd be out of the system and on my own. The days turned into months, and I kept trying to get information about Emma. I begged Mrs. Crenshaw for the address of Emma's adoptive parents, for any contact details, but she always had the same answer. It's not your business anymore. She's gone. Move on. Move on? How could I move on? How could I just let Emma disappear from my life like that? She was my sister. I had promised to protect her, and I had failed. When I finally turned 18 and aged out of the system, I had no plan. I was released from the children's home with nothing but a small backpack of clothes and a few dollars to my name. No one gave me any information about Emma, and no one cared that I had no idea where to go or what to do. I was just another orphan leaving the system. No one's problem anymore. But I wasn't done. I was determined to find Emma. She was out there, somewhere, and I was going to bring her back. The first step was getting a job, earning enough money to support myself while I searched for her. I took whatever work I could find, stocking shelves, washing dishes, sweeping floors, anything that paid. I rented a tiny, dingy apartment that smelled like mildew and loneliness, but it was a roof over my head. Every night, I sat in that apartment, scouring the internet, making phone calls, and trying to track down Emma. I didn't have much to go on, no phone number, no address. All I knew was the Sinclair's last name and that they had taken my sister from me. It wasn't until a year later that I finally got a break. One evening, while scrolling through adoption forums and blogs, I came across a post on a forum for adoptees. The user, going by the name Ella B., had written a post asking for advice on finding her birth family. She wrote that she had been adopted with her brother from a children's home, but they had been separated. Her adoptive parents hadn't told her much, and she was desperate to find her brother. My heart skipped a beat. Could it be her? The details were too similar to be a coincidence. I immediately sent a private message, my hands shaking as I typed. Ella, I think I might be your brother. My name is your name, and I was separated from my sister in a children's home years ago. Please tell me where you are, or if there's a way I can contact you. I've been looking for you. The next few days were agony. I checked my messages obsessively, refreshing the page every few minutes, hoping for a reply. And then, finally it came. Her message was short, but it was all I needed. Brother? Is it really you? I've been looking for you too. We need to talk. We exchanged phone numbers and arranged a call. I was so nervous I could barely hold the phone when it finally rang. Hello, her voice was soft, tentative. It's me, I whispered. It's really me. There was a pause, and then I heard her sob on the other end of the line. I thought I'd never find you. We talked for hours that night, catching up on everything we'd missed. Emma, now going by Ella, was living with the Sinclairs, but things hadn't been as perfect as I'd imagined. They were kind to her, but distant. They had adopted her, but she had always felt like an outsider in their family. Her adoptive brothers had grown up and moved away, leaving her in a big, cold house with parents who treated her like a charity project rather than a daughter. I never forgot about you, she said. I've been trying to find you, but the orphanage never gave me any information. Me too, I said, my voice tight with emotion. I'll never forgive them for what they did to us. And just like that, the fire of revenge was lit. As happy as I was to be reunited with Emma, there was a part of me that couldn't move on from the injustice we had suffered at the children's home. Mrs. Crenshaw, Miss Agatha, and the other administrators had ruined so many lives. Not just ours, but the lives of countless other children who had passed through their doors. They had been cruel, heartless, and they had taken my sister from me. I wanted them to pay. Emma, who had always been the more forgiving of the two of us, was hesitant at first. I don't know if it's worth it, she said. We're together now. That's all that matters. But for me, it wasn't enough. They had broken us apart, and I couldn't let that go. So, I started to make a plan. I was going to take down the administration of the orphanage. I wasn't sure how yet, but I was determined to make them suffer the way they had made us suffer. I couldn't let it go. Every time I thought about the orphanage, The way they tore Emma from me and the cruelty they inflicted on all the children, my blood boiled. I wasn't a kid anymore, and I had power now, knowledge, resources, and a network of people willing to help me. If the administration thought they could get away with what they had done, they were sorely mistaken. Emma, always the gentle soul, had her doubts. "Is this really necessary?" she asked one evening as we sat in my cramped apartment, surrounded by scattered notes, printouts, and coffee cups. "We're free now. We've found each other. Isn't that enough?" "Emma, they destroyed so many lives, not just ours," I said, leaning back in my chair. "How many other kids were neglected, bullied, or ripped apart from their siblings? How many were told they'd never be wanted? Mrs. Crenshaw and her goons, they need to pay. If we don't stop them, they'll just keep doing it to others." She sighed but nodded slowly. I knew she understood, even if she didn't have the same fire for revenge as I did. Emma had always been the one to forgive, to look for the good in people. I loved that about her, but I wasn't wired that way. I had spent too many years feeling powerless. Now I was going to take control. But I couldn't do this alone. I needed help. I needed people who were smart, cunning, and willing to get their hands dirty. The first person I called was Max. Max had been my roommate in college. Well, not so much a roommate as a guy who slept on my couch because he couldn't afford his own place. He was a hacker, and a good one at that. Max had dropped out of school halfway through his second year, but his talent with computers was undeniable. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but if there was anyone who could get me the dirt I needed, it was him. When I tracked him down, he was living in a tiny studio apartment crammed with monitors, wires, and empty pizza boxes. His hair was longer now, and he was wearing a t-shirt that proudly proclaimed, "I void warranties." "Well, well, well," Max said as he opened the door. "If it isn't my favorite former roommate, what brings you to my humble lair?" "I need your help," I said, getting straight to the point. Max grinned. "That sounds dangerous." "I'm in." I filled him in on the situation, about the children's home, the abuse, the corruption, and how I needed to bring the administration down. Max leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "So, you want me to dig up some dirt on these people? Find out what skeletons they've got in their closets?" "Exactly," I said, nodding. "Oh, this is gonna be fun," Max said, his fingers already flying across the keyboard. "I'll start with the head honcho, Mrs. Crenshaw. If she's as crooked as you say she is, there's bound to be something shady in her past. Let's see what we can find." The second person I recruited was Lucy. She had grown up in the same children's home as Emma and me, though she had left a few years before we did. Lucy was tough. The kind of tough you only get from surviving a place like that. She had made a name for herself as a private investigator, and she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. When I reached out to her, she didn't hesitate. "That place was a nightmare," she said, her voice hard. "I've been waiting for someone to take them down. I'll help, no question." With Max and Lucy on my side, I felt like we had a real shot at this. The plan was coming together. Max would dig up whatever dirt he could find on Mrs. Crenshaw and the other administrators, and Lucy would investigate any physical evidence. Missing funds, hidden transactions, anything we could use to expose them. But we needed one more person. Someone on the inside. The orphanage had a high turnover rate with employees, but there was one person who had been there since I was a kid, a janitor named George. George was a quiet, middle-aged man who had always seemed out of place at the orphanage. He was kind to the children, never raised his voice, and often slipped us extra food when the staff wasn't looking. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but I hoped he still worked there. If he did, he might be willing to help us from the inside. After some digging, I found out that George was still at the orphanage, and I arranged to meet him at a coffee shop near his house. He looked older now, with more gray in his hair and deeper lines around his eyes, but he still had that same gentle demeanor. "I was wondering when someone would come back for them," George said quietly after I explained what we were planning. "They've been getting away with this for too long." I've seen things, heard things. It's worse than you think. Worse? I asked, leaning forward. What do you mean? George glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening. Mrs. Crenshaw, she's been embezzling money for years. Donations, government grants, you name it. She pockets most of it, and the kids get whatever's left over. That's why the place is falling apart. I clenched my fists under the table. I had suspected there was financial corruption, but hearing it confirmed made my blood boil. Will you help us? I asked. George nodded. I'll do whatever I can. I've wanted to see her taken down for years. With Max digging up digital evidence, Lucy gathering physical proof, and George feeding us intel from the inside, we were ready to strike. Max didn't disappoint. After a few weeks of hacking into various accounts and databases, he found exactly what we needed: bank records showing that Mrs. Crenshaw had been siphoning off thousands of dollars from the orphanage's budget into her own private account. She had also been accepting bribes from families to push certain children to the front of the adoption line, kids from wealthier backgrounds or with desirable traits, while kids like me and Emma were left behind. She's a piece of work, isn't she? Max said, shaking his head as he scrolled through the data. There's enough here to take her down, for sure. Lucy, meanwhile, had uncovered records of misplaced donations, money that was supposed to go to the orphanage but never made it there. She also found old reports of abuse and neglect that had mysteriously been swept under the rug. And George, bless him, had managed to smuggle out copies of internal documents showing how the orphanage had falsified records, lying about the number of children in their care to receive more government funding. We had everything we needed. The next step was exposing the administration. But simply handing over the evidence to the authorities wasn't enough. I wanted everyone to know what these people had done. The cruelty, the theft, the corruption. They needed to be humiliated, just like they had humiliated the children they were supposed to protect. Max helped us set up a website, a public platform where we could upload all the evidence we had gathered. We created a detailed timeline of Mrs. Crenshaw's crimes, complete with scans of the documents George had provided, screenshots of bank records, and testimonies from former orphans like Lucy. We didn't just want to take down the administration, we wanted the whole world to see them for who they really were. Once the website was live, we sent the link to every major news outlet we could think of. Local papers, national news stations, online blogs. We even posted it on social media, tagging anyone and everyone who might care. The response was immediate. Within hours, the story started to spread. News anchors were talking about it on TV, headlines were popping up all over the internet, and people were sharing the story on every social media platform. The orphanage administration had become a national disgrace. It didn't take long for the authorities to get involved. The police raided the orphanage, seizing files and computers, and Mrs. Crenshaw and her cronies were arrested for fraud, embezzlement, and child endangerment. The place was shut down, and the remaining children were transferred to better facilities. As for George, he was hailed as a hero. The media praised him for his courage in coming forward, and he was offered a job at a new, well-run orphanage where he could continue helping children, this time in a place where his kindness would be appreciated. Max and Lucy celebrated with me over beers in my tiny apartment, toasting to a job well done. That was one hell of a takedown, Max said, grinning as he clinked his bottle against mine. I gotta say, this was way more fun than my usual gigs. Justice served, Lucy added, raising her glass. Here's to taking down the bad guys. Emma, ever the optimist, was relieved that it was over. She didn't enjoy the revenge like I did, but she was glad that the children who remained in that horrible place were finally free. And as for me, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I didn't feel angry or powerless. I had taken back control of my life, and I had made sure that the people who hurt us could never do it again. With the administration of the children's home exposed and justice finally served, Emma and I could finally start to move on with our lives. The past would always be a part of us, but it didn't define us anymore. We had each other, and that was enough. As for Mrs. Crenshaw and her team of tormentors, they were behind bars where they belonged. Their legacy of cruelty was over, and the children they had hurt could finally begin to heal. Life went on. Emma and I stayed close, building the relationship we had lost all those years ago. I continued to work, building my business, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly free. Revenge, as it turned out, really was sweet,